Shalom and blessings in Messiah the Branch. The title of this study is the Solar Calendar Part 5. I think it'll have 3 parts, A, B, and C, so that each section can be reviewed independently. So if there's a question or needing clarification, a listener won't have to go back over the whole full study. It'll be in sections. This study will cover Charles Pace's open letter to me from last month, December 2015, during Hanukkah. Before I get started, I want to have an opening thought here. I covered this in a previous video, in the solar calendar. The key principle of Scripture, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a thing is established. Particularly in important matters, and even 3 or more witnesses in some cases. Ellen White says here in this bottom statement, the Lord has endowed us with reasoning powers that we may not be blindly credulous, that is, just believing anything easily without validating it, in our reception of truth. For reason has its part to act. In searching for truth, the Lord would have us put to the stretch all of our powers of mind, that we may be intelligent in the deep things of His Word. But let everyone remember that the world by wisdom knew not God. The Spirit of God must make the right impression upon the mind, or the searcher will not discern spiritual things. The Sun of Righteousness must shed forth His beams, His bright beams, or the darkened mind will not be enlightened. Several more statements here. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. As workers together with God, we should be on guard not to grieve His Holy Spirit by careless, harsh, or disrespectful words, or by indiscreet actions. Our relations with one another should be pleasant. When we do right, the testimony of our own spirit and the testimony of the Spirit of God bear witness that the human mind is under the control of the divine mind. Hereby we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before Him. For if our heart condemn us, God is greater than our heart, and knoweth all things. Beloved, if our heart condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. His word furnishes evidence from which we may draw the conclusion that we are indeed His sons and daughters. We are always to be learners. The Lord will surely help every soul in need of help. Our whole dependence must be upon the one mighty to save, because He understands our position and will help us in every emergency. I have words from the Lord for my brethren. Let no one suppose that he can carry the work alone, and that he must have supreme authority. Let the managers in our institutions counsel and pray with one another. There is work of different kinds to be done, and the workers of varied talents are to supply one another's deficiencies. The Lord desires every man in a position of responsibility to link up with his fellow workers. No worker should shut himself up to himself. Let all the workers unite in counsel. The Lord will have His servants cultivate the spirit of companionship. He who wraps himself about with garments of self-sufficiency, refusing to admit others into brotherly relationship, will fail in gaining the experience that he needs to gain, and others also will be losers. He should let his fellow workers see that he regards them as of value, and not just listeners only. Some are in danger of giving way to envy lest another shall have the supremacy. They are liable not to recognize the gifts of their fellow workers as being necessary to the success of the work as are their own gifts. But true love for God carries with it true reverential trust, and he who loves God will love his brother also. There is to be no ordering, no domineering, no masterly authority. The love of God in a healing, life-giving current is to flow through the life. The Spirit and words and deeds of every worker are to show that he realizes that he is acting in Christ's place. The power that he receives from the great teacher is the power to educate others, not the power to order or dictate. He is to come to Christ as one who desires to know how to teach and help others. I'll end there with this opening thought. Bear in mind with this last statement she makes here that in the book of Acts, in the early church, the first century church, the apostolic church, 2,000 years ago, this is exactly how that church worked, how it operated. That there were the 12 apostles, they were essentially a leading council, but there was no singular fellow servant who was ordering and was the only teacher. There was no Joshua of today among them. The Joshua of today was the Holy Spirit herself, all throughout the book of Acts. You can read it for yourself in various verses where it says that the Holy Spirit forbade one or told another which one where to go, who to contact, and who to talk to. And I may deal with that in a later video. But this is what we call the first Brass Mountain Church, that first century church that Victor Houteff portrays on his prophecy charts based on Zechariah 6, the two brass mountains, and that Victor Houteff depicts here on one of his charts, the Ezekiel 4 chart, the two brass mountains, one 2,000 years ago and the one that is coming into existence today, the church in her purity, here at the top of the page. The one brass mountain, the apostolic church, was the type of the latter or end-time brass mountain church. We need to understand that because, as Victor Houteff said, where there's a type, there's a truth. And the Holy Spirit was the leader and the Joshua of today, and is the Joshua of today, of both of these brass mountain churches. And there is no other type to show otherwise. I'd like to go to Charles Pace's letter. I have highlighted various parts here to emphasize certain points and to make a point, and where it needs to be clarified and controverted, where he's defining historical events that are absolutely not true. He is defining events without any references outside of himself, only his own mind and his own words. And if we do that, then we violate, if we accept that premise, then we violate the scriptural counsel and the Spirit of Prophecy Council. In the mouth of two or three witnesses, a thing is established. Beginning here at the top, this email with links to my video studies on the subject is a response to Tom Caldwell and his theory of the solar calendar he is purporting with the March 20 and September 22nd equinoxes, which were redefined by Christopher Clavius, a Jesuit mathematics teacher and astronomer hired by Pope Gregory VIII in 1582, to redefine and fix one date, the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, and create the Gregorian calendar, so that the Pope could calendarize the Roman Catholic feast days, etc. Well, they only fixed the dates on their calendar. They didn't create some new kind of equinox. I can prove this from another historical reference that I have in this, hopefully in this part. So they didn't redefine anything but the actual calendar date. They didn't define or create some kind of a new concept of equinox. The equinox, spring and summer, has been recognized universally among all cultures throughout history. And these are the kind of historical references that people in the field of history and documenting events throughout time have been very careful to validate, particularly even astronomers. And that's why I use an astronomy program. And continuing on here, he says, the Creator's calendar defines their system of feasts and holy days, but the two calendars cannot be used interchangeably. Oh, that's true. The Gregorian calendar and the true calendar, whatever you want to call it, solar, Jubilee, Enoch calendar, they're all pretty much the same thing, have variances with true time, the Sabbath, etc., the feast days. But the weekly cycle was not based on any calendar or calendar change. The weekly cycle was from creation, continuous. And Charles attempting to bring in a new calendar system which redefines the weekly cycle is something I absolutely reject and will not be silent against. He says, especially the dates and definition of the equinoxes. Well, that's exactly what Charles Pace has done. He's redefined the equinoxes to, I believe it's August and February, based on the twilight times, which were never used throughout history. Never, because twilight times could never be determined except by modern methods, computer and computer-generated tables. It cannot be observed. It's too subjective. It's not objective. He says here the March 20 date was defined and adopted by the man of sin, or the sin of man, to make us think the times and laws were changed correctly. That statement is also false. Ellen White, Victor Hadoff, Ben Roden never say anything about this, that the equinoxes were part of the man of sin's changing times and laws in Daniel 7:25. It was always concerning the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath and the weekly cycle, or changing the day of rest from the seventh day to the first day, which happens to be fall out on the 2 days of Saturday and Sunday. It says, but they were changed to deceive the very elect if possible. Thank the Lords, they have delivered us after 430 years of bondage to the Roman calendar, and have given us a more sure and accurate way of keeping in time with their last moves, which will be rapid ones. A more sure way would have to be something more than one person saying this is the way it is. When I go through some of these historical articles, I am appealing to something outside of myself that others have researched and are in agreement with, whether Protestant or Catholic, because the facts don't lie. Some people don't like the facts, but that's their problem. The important thing to remember here is that Ellen White, even James White, Victor Hadoff, Ben Roden, and Lois Roden all used historical references in their promoting their various truths that they taught. In a former video, I addressed this very clearly with examples. I believe it was over probably 2 years ago. This video here, the Sabbath Challenge Questions and Answers, where I show, not only from Ellen White but also Victor Hadoff, that it's important to use historical references as other witnesses, independent witnesses outside of our personal beliefs, outside of our faith and personal prejudices, or even outright lies that are being taught. Because if someone doesn't appeal to something and someone outside of themselves on empirical points of truth, especially, then they're setting themselves up as a supreme authority, which we don't want. We don't want that. That's popery in the church. And this kind of presumed authority is dangerous to the church because it's claiming infallibility. That is, the doctrine of infallibility brought into the Protestant movement at its highest level, which is the branch. So if you want to take a look at that video on your after this one or the future, it's on the Branch Insight channel, the Sabbath Challenge, Questions and Answers Part 1. Next I'll go to a clip of a previous video I did. It's about maybe 5 minutes. And the title of it was The Equinox. It's on the Branch Insight channel also. And I'll play just a few minutes of that here. Even the solar calendar, which came about after the flood. Brother Hoddif presents the equinoxes as a correction point, a reset point, twice a year, so that people don't have to be confused and misguided by the 365-day yearly cycle. Continuing on here, so that the northward equinox would have the same date in the new Gregorian calendar as it had in the Julian calendar, March 21. 10 days were dropped so that October 5th became October 15th in 1582, when the Gregorian calendar was initiated. This reform took several centuries to spread through the nations that used the Julian calendar, although the Russian Church year still uses the Julian. Those nations that adopted this calendar on or after 1700 had to drop more than 10 days. Great Britain, for instance, dropped 11. The use of the equinox that we understand today, the March and September equinoxes, were in use prior to the calendar adjustment in 1582. So Clavius, the astronomer for the Pope, Pope Gregory, did not create some kind of a new determination for the equinoxes. This equinox system has been recognized by this world and all ancient cultures for thousands of years before the calendar change of 1582. But the current counter evidence to this does not make any sense and does not present any evidence to show that the Roman astronomer Clavius actually set up some kind of a new equinox. He didn't. I won't read all of these comments here. Some of it gets technical. Here's an interesting point here, as I've stated before in previous videos. Here is a reference from the historian Josephus, the Jewish historian, in dealing with the weekly cycle. It appears that Jehu Michael's reference to the Roman poets, as well as this reference from Suetonius, is a strong indication that the seventh-day Sabbath had become more tied into Roman society than most people realize. Possibly this is one of the reasons Josephus said in his historical reference, Appian 282 through 283, the masses have long since shown a keen desire to adopt our religious observances. And there is not one city, Greek or barbarian, not a single nation to which our custom of abstaining from work on the seventh day has not spread, and where our fasts and the lighting of lamps and many of our prohibitions in the matter of food are not observed. End quote. Now, Josephus, in some circles, was considered a traitor because he was Jewish, and he pretty much went along with Roman view of things. But it's also been observed by historians that later in Josephus' writings he starts pushing aside his Roman glorification of his Roman captives and starts to uphold his fundamental Jewish beliefs, particularly in relation to the Sabbath. I'm going to read this statement one more time to let it sink in, because the Roman calendar, the original Roman Julian calendar, did not change the Hebrew weekly cycle. In fact, it's the other way around. Had the Jewish or Hebrew weekly cycle been changed and adapted to the Roman calendar and capitulated to the Romans, there would have been some kind of an outcry, something in the historical writings, some kind of resistance, some kind of protest by other writers, because the entire Jewish nation didn't just all of a sudden change their weekly cycle to accommodate Rome. They never did. Not a shred of evidence historical for such an event. Again, Josephus writes, "The masses have long since shown a keen desire to adopt our religious observances, and there is not one city, Greek or barbarian, not a single nation, to which our custom of abstaining from work on the seventh day has not spread, and where our fasts and lighting of lamps and many of our prohibitions in the matter of food are not observed." This statement also applies to those who teach and promulgate the lunar Sabbath theory, who say that the Sabbath doesn't fall on the day that most Sabbath keepers observe it on today, which happens to fall on the Roman Saturday. In further commentary in this article, and this is a quote, I think it's from alaya.com, "In consideration of these things, it appears to me that the Romans picked up the recurring 7-day week from the Jews, not the other way around. For 5 centuries or longer, the Romans had kept an 8-day week, with the 7 days being named by the letters of the alphabet, A through H. They did not keep a 7-day week until they came into more contact with Sabbath-keeping Jews in the early centuries BCE, before the Common Era. The fact that they named the days of the week after various planetary idols doesn't prove that they originated the recurring 7-day week. The naming of the various days after planetary idols appears to have originated either with the Babylonians or the Hindu civilization, not the Romans. Now, with that review, that brief video clip from my Equinox study, I will appeal again to another outside reference source that is indisputable. You won't find any references against it anywhere online or any historical references. Here we see a depiction of the 4 seasons of the year. Science agrees universally. Every culture in the world agrees universally, even throughout history, that these 4 seasons of the year are determined at these particular points of the year: March, September, December, and June, the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices. Now, the Church of Rome didn't define these 4 points of the year in 1582. They existed previously, and I have several other references at least that I've looked up. I could find many to validate this. Anyone who tells you that there is an equinox based on the twilight times twice a year and rather than the 4 points of the calendar year of the 4 seasons, and also the daily reference, the objective reference of sundown every day, which begins the new day rather than twilight times, is not paying attention to history and is attempting to prove something by their own word alone, no other witnesses. And I've asked Charles Pace for his references on his assertions, and he has never provided anything. I've even done some research for him, which I'm going to present in this, probably in the next part B of this part 5 of the solar calendar. But this kind of an image where the 4 seasons are depicted, March, September, December, and June, is not something that a man made up. These are the natural motions of the Earth around the Sun each year at the 4 distinct points that are easy to prove on any astronomy program, which is why I use it in a program, astronomy program, to prove my points. I didn't create the program. And if there's something wrong with it, then the scientific and historical community would be dishonest or deceived by some great world power. There's no indication of that, because God would not allow some power that thought to change times and laws to completely cover up the truth so God's people wouldn't know it. So keep this in mind when somebody talks about changing or redefining what the equinoxes are. Clavius in 1582 did not redefine what the equinoxes were. They only redefined the date on the calendar, because the Julian calendar, as I've said many times before, wasn't working. The year was drifting backwards through the months, all the way into winter, and they couldn't have Easter or Passover, for that matter, coming about in the wintertime, or beginning the 14-day count to Passover as far back as March 10th, and I'm going to prove that right now. On timeanddate.com, which I have, and this is on timeanddate.com, which I have used previous, I typically bring up the tables on the seasons of the year, the solstices and the equinoxes. This one is set for Kansas City, central USA, for convenience. And you'll notice in 2016, this year, it comes about on March 19th. Well, if Clavius and Pope Gregory, I guess it was 13th, redefined the equinox, how come this is not following after their redefinition as far as the dates? The dates do vary slightly based on leap years, whether or not a day is added or not at the end of February, which is not the case every year. Leap years come about periodically, I think every 3 years or so. One day added at the end of February 29th, which I think is happening this year. So this year, 2016, March 19th will be the equinox. It comes in at 11:30 at night, Central Daylight Time. You can look at these for each year. You can look up the equinoxes, vernal and autumnal, and check it for yourself. The interesting thing about this function on timeanddate.com is I can go back hundreds and hundreds of years. I could probably go back 1,000 years or more here and there reference. Yeah, I can go all the way back to 1 AD. Determine what the seasons were. I'm going to go here to 1550 to 1599. It's going to come up, calculate the It'll be for Kansas City, but it'll show me what the actual dates of the equinoxes were back in 15. I'll use the very year that the Gregorian calendar came in, 1582. Check it for yourself. Here it is, right here, 1582. Look at that, March 10th. Why is this date March 10th? This is dealing with the yearly and monthly calendar. Had nothing to do with the weekly cycle. Anyone that says otherwise is being dishonest, plain and simple, and they can't prove it otherwise by any reference outside of their own words and their own thinking, or whatever it is they're trying to put over on us. But in 1582, it's a long table here. The March equinox in 1582 was March 10th. This is the problem with it. This was actually the Julian calendar here that this program is bringing up. Prior to 1582, they only had the Julian calendar, and because of the accumulating error year by year, the equinox was moving backwards in the on the written calendar or on the established yearly calendar, whether it was Gregorian or Julian or any other calendar. And that's serious because March 10th is still in the wintertime. So this is just an example of what Charles Pace is not telling the people, and the references that you should go to validate, prove all things, hold fast that which is good, just like the Apostle Paul said. You have to prove it or disprove it, one way or the other. So 1582, March 10th, that's nowhere near March 20th. This is why the Gregorian calendar was instituted, to correct this backwards drift of the calendar throughout the year, which was continuing to get worse and worse year by year. And you can validate this on timeanddate.com. You can go to the little function here to the right and just change the year. Anywhere from year 1 AD to 2099. Now, once again, I'm going to go to Victor Hadov's writings and compare reference to reference what's being said and show the confusion factor or the disinformation and redefining that's being put out by Charles Pace. If you don't have Victor Hadov's writings, there are a number of sites on the internet you can go to read them online or even download them. If you want the link to download them yourself in a searchable format, I can send that to you if you want to contact me through the email on this on the Branch Ensign channel. But the site I like to use is you can see the link at the top, sdabol.org. That's sdabreadoflife.org. You can go to the symbolic codes of Victor Hadov, and the ones I've been using on the calendar are what are considered the new codes, which not every Davidian site republishes, but this particular one does. I happen to know the author of this site in I think it's North Carolina. But in 13 code, down here at the bottom, 13 code 7 and 8, number 9, I think 11 and 12, 9 and 10, he has 3 sections here on the Sabbath observance, and this is a study by Victor Hadov exposing and controverting the lunar Sabbath theory, which basically is still alive and going today in among a lot of Sabbath keepers, Adventists included, where they say that the weekly cycle is reset every month. And Victor Houteff had to deal with this in his day with a brochure he talks about in volume 13 of the Symbolic Code. Well, what Charles has done, he resets initially when he changed the Sabbath in 2011. He established it in the middle of the week, which we now call Wednesday. But that was based on the same principle as the lunar Sabbath theory, resetting the weekly cycle whether monthly or yearly. Both ways are false. Both ways are apostasy of the Sabbath. Victor Houteff makes that very plain in this. Months later, after Charles Pace had made this change, he contacted me and stated that he had found some new information, and the equinoxes were wrong, and the weekly cycle could be reset permanently, and based on the fourth day of creation, which is not to be done anyway, because the creation week and the fourth day of creation are two separate entities, two separate timekeeping elements. The two could never be mixed, and the weekly cycle or the Sabbath itself could never be based on a count from the fourth day of creation week, when the sun and moon were created and stars. But going here to the particular symbolic code, I've quoted from this in other previous videos. I'm going to go over it again for emphasis, certain parts of it. It is very applicable, even though he's talking about mainly the false theory of the lunar Sabbath, lunar-based Sabbath. It very much applies to the any solar-based Sabbath as well, or any other redefinition of the equinox, the time of year that the Bible states in Exodus 12:2, which says, "This is the beginning of months unto you." It's when Moses brought Israel out of Egypt. It didn't say this is the beginning of weeks. It says this is the beginning of months, meaning a monthly, the count of the months throughout the year, 12 months. So it's basically saying this is the beginning of the year to you. The weekly cycle was always completely separate, and I'm having to go back and forth between these two concepts, the weekly cycle and the yearly calendar, because Charles has mixed them together in his own theory of a perfect calendar. And Ben Roden said there couldn't be a perfect calendar in the Elijah letter until the earth was righted on its axis, which happened, the axis and the orbital variation and disturbance took place at the time of the flood. Going down here in 13 Symbolic Code 7, you can read this from the Davidian Bread of Life site, all of it if you'd like. Victor Houteff, and I've taken this from a Davidian site because it didn't come from me. You can look it up for yourself, even though I quote from 13 Code 9 and 10 and 7 and 8 in my study, the Genesis Clock. But here, Victor Houteff says on page 10, "It is true that the names of the months and the days of the week are of mythological origin, but the cycle of the week, as we shall see, is from time immemorial." Okay? Ellen White says the same thing. Ben Roden says the same thing. Each movement kept the same Sabbath since 1844. He goes on to say here, the following paragraphs briefly bring forth solar, lunar, and biblical facts, not implications, that the weekly cycle has never been and never can be controlled by any lunar or solar calendar, and that the Church under God's direction has never either in the Old or the New Testament kept a lunar Sabbath. Now he's talking about the lunar Sabbath here. Charles Pace has repeatedly stated that the calendar is neither lunar nor solar. Neither lunar nor solar. And Victor Houteff is making this statement in the context of the weekly cycle from creation. Please understand that. Charles does not differentiate or properly define what Victor Houteff is saying here, or try to show what he's really saying with his broad statement that the calendar is neither lunar nor solar, because in just a page or two down I'm going to show you exactly what else Victor Houteff says, which we have to harmonize with this statement here. Brother Houteff is clearly stating that the Sabbath itself, and you read this carefully yourself and pray about it, the Sabbath itself cannot be based on either lunar or solar. The seventh-day Sabbath cannot be based on either lunar or solar. That's very true. Now, he makes another statement a little ways down here that could be taken out of context or mixed and misunderstood. Victor Houteff says, let me see here. This is the state. Before I read the one just above, I read only the ones in green for brevity. Here's where Victor Houteff says, still further, on page 4, 13 Code 9, still further, the calendar which the prophets used in both the Old and New Testaments was not lunar, but solar. What's he talking about? I'll read the whole paragraph here. Still further, the calendar which the prophets used in both the Old and New Testaments was not lunar, but solar. In other words, it is solar, whatever he's talking about, and he explains here. For example, in Noah's time, 150 days equaled 5 months, 30 days to a month. Daniel 7:25, 12:7, also Revelation 12:14, time is dividing of times. 3.5 years are interpreted in Revelation 12:6, 13 and chapter 13 to be 1260 days or 42 months, 30 days to a month. Heaven's way of measuring time is therefore not lunar but solar. Now what is he speaking of here in relation to that previous statement where he says that the Sabbath could not be based on either lunar or solar? And that's true. The difference with this statement is he's talking about the yearly calendar. This calendar came into effect on the 4th day of creation. Not the first day of creation, but on the 4th day of creation. Charles Pace doesn't differentiate this at all, which makes his general statements to prove his point completely false. I'm going to read this again. Please, the first and last sentences. He's speaking here of this calendar, the yearly calendar, or the calendar that was introduced to Moses in Exodus 12:2, which he grew up with. Victor Houteff says he grew up with it in Egypt, because he says the Egyptian calendar and the one Moses instituted in Exodus 12:2 was the one on the same calendar. He says here, still further, the calendar which the prophets used in both the Old and New Testaments was not lunar, but solar. Then he shows why it's solar, based on the yearly cycle. Not the weekly cycle, but the yearly cycle. In the last sentence he says, heaven's way of measuring time is, therefore, not lunar, but solar. Now this is not in reference to the weekly cycle at all. So why is Charles Pace observing Sunday? Supposedly as the 7th day that was hidden, covered up by Rome, fooled all the Sabbath-keeping churches since the 1800s and before, mid-1800s, 1844, 1846, and made fools of them all, supposedly. So he's saying, Victor Houteff is showing here in 13 Code that the weekly cycle, based on the previous statement, right here, hold on. this statement here, where he says that the following paragraphs briefly bring forth solar, lunar, and biblical facts, not applications, that the weekly cycle has never been and never can be controlled by any lunar or solar calendar, and that the Church under God's direction has never either in the Old or New Testament kept a lunar Sabbath. This statement here on page 11, the following paragraphs briefly bring forth solar, lunar, and biblical facts, that the weekly cycle never has been, never can be controlled by any lunar or solar calendar, and that the Church under God's direction has never either in the Old or New Testament kept a lunar Sabbath. And the other reference, he states that the calendar therefore is not lunar but solar. So he's showing two different calendar systems here, the weekly and the yearly. That's the difference. Victor Hata further, in some of these other good statements, here he goes quoting from encyclopedias and historical references to prove his point, because Victor Hata didn't teach or think inside of a box or inside of a fishbowl in his own head. He was proving to the people what he was saying, what the Spirit was showing him, whether it be the weekly Sabbath or the yearly feasts, that he could prove it from independent sources. In this statement, he says the use of the week was introduced in the Roman Empire about the 1st or 2nd century of the Christian era from Egypt, and had been recognized independently of Christianity before the emperor. Constantine confirmed it by enjoining the observance of the Christian Sabbath. In that case, it was the first day of the week. With the Mohammedans, the week has also religious character, Friday being observed by them as the Sabbath. From that encyclopedia source. The period of 7 days was used by the Brahmins in India with the same denominations employed by us, and was alike found in the calendars of Jews, Egyptians, Arabs, and Assyrians, Standard Dictionary Definition Calendar. The week is a period of 7 days, having no reference whatever to the celestial motions, a circumstance which it owes its unalterable uniformity. It was employed from time immemorial in almost all Eastern countries, and as it forms neither an aliquot part of the year nor of the lunar month, those who reject the Mosaic recital will be at a loss, as Delambre remarks, to assign it to an origin having less semblance of possibility. Encyclopedia Britannica. The bottom sentence here states, the week, moreover, explains Encyclopedia Britannica, is a period of 7 days having no reference whatsoever to the celestial motions. Please read these statements for yourself. 13 code 7 and 8 and 13 code 9 on the website I just showed. And from Bread of Life, Davidian site. There are others, but this one has all of the codes. I think I'll conclude here and go to part B. Thank you for your attention. Blessings.